The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. We're really pleased to have with us today Delegate Michael Webert. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you too, Woody. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
We were just talking about travel.
Yeah.
And you commute every day. I didn't realize that.
Yes, sir. 2 hours.
And so how did you make it during the storm? Of course, that occurred close to a weekend.
Oh, thank goodness it started on Friday. And we didn't have session that Friday.
Right.
Sorry, it started Thursday. So since session was canceled, I drove home, stayed home, and spent the weekend on my skid steer and playing with my kids.
Great. That was wonderful.
It was great.
Good. How's your district doing economically? We know we had the Great Recession. We've had sequestration. I assume that they've had some negative impacts on your district.
A little bit. It depends on which part of the district you're talking about, simply because Fauquier in of itself was a little bit isolated. However, Front Royal and Culpeper, I think, felt the recession a little bit better, a little bit worse. And with sequestration, a lot of the folks, I think, that in Fauquier and some of the government employees obviously felt it in that those that worked for private industries and things, defense, and that, I think felt it. However, I think coming out of it, we did very well. Our unemployment in Fauquier is still very low. Warren County was improving until very recently. The stock market is in the process of not being what it was a few months ago. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully this is just a correction, and we'll be able to stabilize moving forward.
What about military installations? Do you have any of those in your district?
Quantico is it's basically the southern end of Fauquier County. And so, Stafford and Fauquier in that area deal with Quantico quite a bit. So, I think that the recession had an impact there. Mm-hmm. However, I think just due to our proximity to Washington, D.C., right, due to proximity to Northern Virginia and some of the tech industries there that didn't suffer as badly in the recession, we were somewhat insulated. So it's been helpful.
Now, your committee assignments include agriculture,
mm-hmm,
I think county, cities, and towns, and militia and police.
Yes, sir.
Agriculture is your bailiwick, so to speak, your lane.
Absolutely.
Because you have a fairly large farm that you operate. Talk to us about the importance of agriculture to the economy of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Well, the governor and any other politician will tell you our agriculture and timber combined are our largest industry. If you count agritourism, it gets even bigger. And we are still an agrarian-based country. We're still an agrarian-based state, or Commonwealth. And exports, our winery industry, these are still industries that are very, very large. I have a large farming operation. We ship soybeans across the world. Our corn goes to Harrisonburg. Harrisonburg and the Valley still is a large poultry processing plant. I mean, they're, I think, third or fourth on the East Coast. So we are still a very agricultural-based state in that Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads and Richmond are really the only city centers that we've got, mm-hmm, in regards to technology and some of those other things. So it's vastly important. That's one of the reasons, as we were discussing earlier, that our port system is very important. The inland port, and just outside my district, I consider it in my district, but just outside my district is very important.
At Front Royal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In that the port actually buys trains, whole trains, to ship down to, the port. And so, for us moving commodities, moving any goods it makes it vastly cheaper to do so. And that's one of the reasons why, hopefully, as our budget moves forward, there was in the bond package there was money for the Port of Virginia, because as you come in off of 64 and some of those other areas, we are getting bottlenecked. We need to improve our infrastructure. We haven't done so in quite a few years. I know that the last 3 or 4 years we've been talking about the widening of the Panama Canal. We have the deepest port on the eastern seaboard, so that is an advantage for us, and that we have to take advantage of, and that we can outcompete New York, Baltimore, Savannah, and those large ports as well, because we're at a prime area on the East Coast to be able to transport all our goods, and the inland port is just part of that whole transportation package to be able to get goods and services to folks, and it gives us a competitive advantage as a state.
So rail obviously is an important component of that as well, because a lot of those goods and services are transported by rail.
Well, in Norfolk Southern and Norfolk Southern primarily, but CSX is currently investing. They have the ability to double stack. So if you're sitting at a railroad crossing and you see two containers stacked on top of each other, that means that Norfolk Southern and CSX have gone through that entire system and widened or heightened everything to be able to get that, to be able to double your transport. And it just makes it that much more efficient for us. And being right where we are on the eastern seaboard, being able to ship anywhere because of our location, as they say in real estate, location is everything. It gives us a real competitive advantage.
And how important is it to your industry and others throughout the state to be able to export goods and services abroad?
That's huge. Almost all of our soybeans end up being either made into mash or being exported. I know that for me, almost all of my soybeans were exported to either Taiwan or Japan. Purdue has a big plant down on the port at Curtis Bay. So for instance, there was talk that they weren't going to invest as much down there because we didn't have the infrastructure. So now we're putting forth the infrastructure. Hopefully companies like Purdue will put in the necessary infrastructure to be able to load containers, to be able to load ships, to be able to ship more grains and more commodities out. The other thing is, due to our location, we can also, I guess, kind of hijack commodities from other states, West Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, just along the border, and have those goods coming into the state as well, because that would help.
Now, what about beef? I assume that's something that's exported, or is that primarily used domestically? Depends.
We do have companies that do export. They export live cattle. Mostly, but also export beef. For instance, most of my steers either go to Pennsylvania or go to Kansas, simply because that's where the feed yards are. And in Pennsylvania, the feed yards up there, a lot of that beef ends up coming back. We also have a lot of local guys who feed out. So, for instance, we have several guys who feed out steers and heifers, and that ends up being sold at your local Wegmans. So a lot of Wegmans beef. Giant Foods is another corporation that in my district's big. They're in the process of building a very large greenhouse down in Culpeper, and a lot of the fresh veggies that are in that'll be grown in those greenhouses are going to be sold in the tri-county or in the tri-state area, essentially. Parts of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and obviously the district. So agriculture, at least in my district, is a large portion of our industry.
So what are some of the major challenges that you and your colleagues in the farming industry face in terms of, let's say, government regulation, for example?
Well, government regulation, a lot of it has to do with the fact that we are, numbers-wise per person, a very small industry. However, land-wise, we are a very large industry, so we tend to have a very large target on our back when it comes to the Chesapeake Bay cleanup. We have several programs that we have instituted over the years to clean up the bay, and they've been very successful. I fight for funding from the state every year for them, ag BMPs to fence out streams for your cattle, etc. cover crop programs to be able to, so when you take off a crop, you plant a rye or a wheat or something over it to keep the soils intact during the winter when erosion can happen the most. So we have a lot of these various programs. We have nutrient resource management programs where, so for instance, nutrient resource management for me, we soil test every year. So we know exactly what's in our soils so that we can make, when we make fertilizer recommendations, we know how much we need to put on without not only affecting our bottom line, because if you put in too much, your margins are much smaller, but also so that we don't put down too much phosphorus, so a lot of it ends up washing out and going into the bay. So we have a lot of those regulations. You have a lot of folks that are continuously thinking that we are the largest polluter of the bay, and sometimes that's not exactly true. We are the easiest to see sometimes, very much so. However, I would think that with the exception of a few bad apples, as you do in every industry, your farmer is one of the most industrious and caring people of the land that you'll ever meet. And they deeply care about the conditions of their soil. They deeply care about the conditions of their animals. And so I think we've reached a point now where we need to start looking at some of the other things that contribute to the bay. We had a nice we had a stormwater package that has moved forward a couple of years ago. So as a state, we're working on that. As part of the governor's bond package, we have some stormwater, not stormwater, but waste management money there to help with waste management from a sewage standpoint. And so we need to start looking at that. We've also done a couple of good things in the Commonwealth in that we have timed release nitrogen in your commercial fertilizer that you buy at Home Depot. Time release phosphorus was 2 years ago. Delegate Lingenfelter carried that. Because, I mean, quite frankly, there's more acreage in yards than there is in corn in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So your average homeowner, I think, if they are educated, are also just as responsible as some of the farmers.
Sure. Now I take it that you and members of the committee and other members of the General Assembly work hand in hand with the Secretary of Agriculture,
Absolutely.
Todd Haymore.
Absolutely. I often joke that because I'm a Republican and our governor is across the aisle, that's one thing that we always agree upon is that Todd Haymore was reappointed as Secretary of Agriculture. They've done a very good job, and I would commend the governor and the secretary, especially on their exports, and especially on, we instituted in 2012 the APHID grant. And the APHID grant is essentially kind of like the governor's opportunity fund in that if you have a company like a processor that wants to expand or put in a new processing plant, it's going to benefit numerous producers as well as provide jobs, that we as the state will provide a grant to help them get started. I mean, that's how the folks that are growing vegetables for Giant in Culpeper, they've received a small grant. I mean, they're going to invest several million.
Right.
But I think they received $75,000 from the state and $75,000 from the county of Culpeper in order to increase their greenhouse operation down there.
Now there's a new buzzword going around. It's called Go Virginia. There's some legislation that encompasses about 4 or 5 different bills that are working their way through the General Assembly. It's an old concept, but it's getting heightened scrutiny in terms of cooperation among regions, cooperation with the public sector, the private sector, and our institutions of higher learning, I believe. Talk to us about the importance of that initiative.
Well, that initiative is very important in that it's really being led kind of by private industry rather than just a public policy, oh, we're going to do this. It's private industry saying, here's kind of what we need, working with institutions of higher learning to get what we need, to get the folks that we need to implement the necessary programs and businesses. I mean, you can want to put a business in Southwest Virginia, it doesn't matter what it is, but if it doesn't necessarily work in that district or in that area, i.e. you could put, let's put a database down there. Well, that's fine, but it's not going to provide that many jobs. You've got a dying coal industry. You've got, but there's other resources there. So you need to pair those. So like Southwest, you've got you've got a nice cattle industry. You've got the tobacco industry is being consolidated essentially down there, but you also have peanuts. You have other industries that are going in as well. So I like the fact that Go Virginia is more of a private industry driven dynamic than some of the other things that we have tried.
And as I understand it, the kinds of projects that you just described will percolate up from the bottom. They will be examined at the local level, recommended ultimately to a 21-member board, I believe, and that's how those projects will be vetted and funded.
Yeah, absolutely. Rather than a top-down approach, you're getting private industry and local input to really say, this is what our region needs, this is what our community needs. And I think by taking that approach, it'll be much more efficient and much more productive. As we all know, various forms of government have their favorite projects, right, and not all of them are successful. We could have all the best intentions in the world, and we do. We pass legislation, we design programs that have all the best intentions. But when it comes to metrics, those projects and policies that start at the local level, I would venture to say, tend to be more productive.
Tell us a little bit about some legislation that you are pursuing this session in terms of franchising.
So, for instance, the Business Development Caucus,
right,
that I've helped form. We are Chris Head, the chairman, one of the founders, along with myself and former delegate Ramadan and former delegate Mike Watson. We now have several other delegates that are with us, obviously. But what it does is it states that a franchisee's employees are not employees of the franchisor. And that was in regards to the National Labor Relations Board basically saying, no, they are. And the reason being is that you have your franchisee. Say I'm a franchisee. Say I own, I don't want to necessarily name a single company,
but
I own a franchise, and I have 2 or 3 stores. Those are my employees, and how I deal with those employees should not reflect upon the larger franchisor whose headquarters are in California. And that can have implications not only on healthcare, but on our labor laws, et cetera. So that was the purpose behind that legislation. We're working on legislation this year, and we're going to be going into next year with Series LLC, which is basically right now as an entity, I've got as a farming entity, I could have an LLC for my trucking.
And that's a limited liability
company, yes, sir. And I could have essentially an LLC for my cattle operation and an LLC for X2. And the reason a lot of LLCs do that is that they are dispersing their liabilities. Well, what Series LLC does is, and we got the idea from Delaware. There's 14 states that currently do this, and Delaware was the first in 1994. In that I'll have a larger LLC. I'll only file once with the SEC. I'll only file one income, tax income, but then I can assign my liabilities to Series. And we thought this was a great idea to cut back on the paperwork, cut back on the fees, cut back, and you're only filing once for your taxes. As it's moved forward, we learned that with the Virginia Bar Association, there is a work group that is currently working on this to put together recommendations so that the language for the code will be able to allow business to uniformly across the nation from state to state. The Uniform Code Commission, or whatever it's called. So we're gonna be working on that next year as well. So it's been an interesting journey for when it comes to business policy in the Commonwealth, because we really do need to pare it back. I mean, everybody's talking about our tax code and how broad it is and how thick it is when you look at the book and all that, but we really need to pare it back to make businesses it just makes it easier to do business.
Right. Efficiency, more efficiency. in
Much
government.
more efficient. We need that. We drastically need that, not only at state level, but at the federal level as well.
Right. Commodity boards, that's something else that you're
Absolutely.
working on.
One of the things that we've learned over the years is we have a number of commodity boards, and what the commodity boards do is I'm sure you've seen the beef commercials
Yes.
on TV.
Yes.
Well, what that is it's the funding for those commercials and those programs come from what's called the beef checkoff. So when I sell a steer at a local livestock exchange, $1 per head is taken out and sent to the beef checkoff in order to promote that particular commodity. So we have a corn board, we have a soybean board, we have basically every board peanut board, apple board known to man. And over the years, they've gotten, and with some legislation that we worked on a couple of years ago, things got kind of disjointed. And so what we did was we took it upon ourselves, and Farm Bureau and Agribusiness Council met with many of the boards and said, we want to narrow all this stuff down so that everything's fairly uniform, where we've got certain numbers of people on the board, certain amount of nominees, or if there's not a nominee, that kind of thing, where you don't have to have more than 2 nominees. If you have one person that somehow got suckered into serving, the governor can go, okay, you got one, he can serve. But also along those lines, we just basically pared everything down, made it easier to operate. And then we also discovered during the process that because we have the beef checkoff, that Virginia had a self-assessment as well, and for beef. However, we had stopped collecting that 30 years ago because the beef checkoff dollars.
Oh, I see.
So basically they could have started collecting another 25 cents per head. So what happened is we put a moratorium for 2 years so that the beef industry could survey the industry and figure out if we do want to collect that 25 cents, and rather than have it be just for beef, use those dollars to promote the industry in of itself. In that we have Angus, we have Hereford, you have various breeds, etc. And let's face it, Virginia cattle's better.
Well, yes. Another success story for you and other members, but you've been a leader in resolving an initiative that began with the Attorney General of the Commonwealth basically saying that we will no longer have reciprocity in terms of concealed carry permits with about 25 states. That's the derivation of it, I believe. Yep. Give us a little bit of history around that and how it was resolved.
Well, first of all, I need to commend the folks that were integral in the negotiations of this. First, Todd Gilbert, Delegate Gilbert, Senator Reeves, the governor, Secretary Brian Moran, the speaker, and Chairman Lingenfelter. What transpired is the Attorney General recommended that we not have reciprocity with these states, and the superintendent went along with that recommendation. When that occurred in my district, I had numerous people that were up in arms, because you got to remember, Woody, we are dealing with a group of people that statistically are less likely to commit a crime than your average person. In fact, I think it's in Florida, they're statistically less likely to commit a crime than the police forces.
That's interesting.
So you're dealing with a very law-abiding citizen on average. And the governor said himself that over 25 years, there has not been a single incident when an out-of-state concealed carry person has committed a crime. So you're dealing with a very, set of law-abiding citizens. And not only that, but I ended up having quite a few women who travel out of state and they conceal carry to protect themselves. It's their choice to protect themselves. So we felt that we needed to do something. And so 1163 was put in to reestablish reciprocity. And Todd and the governor and all the folks that I mentioned previously got together. And this became an opportunity for a real win for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And that Secretary Moran and the governor looked at the laws and said, okay, we will work with you on getting reciprocity back, and can you work with us in some of these other areas? And so we did. And so, for instance, we have permanent protective orders. And the interesting thing about permanent protective orders is that with a permanent protective order, you have to go before a judge and be heard. And when you're heard and the judge rules that you're going to be subject to this, you lose your ability to possess a firearm, which coincides with federal law as well. In Virginia, you couldn't transport, you couldn't buy, but you could possess a firearm in your home. Now, under this agreement, you can't, and basically we're just matching federal law. The other thing is that the governor's made it known that background checks were a big part of his thing, or his priority.
Right.
So the compromise was that we would provide language so that State Patrol had authority to access NICS and the funds to be at every gun show.
NICS is a database?
Yes, it's the federal database
Okay.
for conducting background checks.
Right.
And so now they'll have the ability, so under a voluntary premise, if I'm selling a firearm to somebody and I think they might be a little bit shady, I can now walk down the aisle and go over to the State Patrol and run a background check.
Because you wouldn't be a licensed under federal law.
This is for all FFL dealers. I mean, it doesn't matter what happens.
Exactly.
I have to run a background
Right.
check. And I mean, just shipping state to state, if I purchase a firearm on the internet and it's being shipped to me, it needs to go to a FFL dealer for a background check. So we worked on that legislation, and then in my legislation we have reciprocity with almost all 50 states, basically, and particularly if a state has 24-hour access to a database. So, for instance, the Commonwealth of Virginia, if I get pulled over for speeding in Georgia, and the officer says, "Hey, do you have a concealed carry?" I said, "Yes," and I hand them my concealed carry. He can check instantaneously whether that concealed carry is valid.
I see.
So, and then we also, in my legislation, have language in regards to you can't shop around for a concealed carry permit. So if I get, if my concealed carry permit gets revoked in the Commonwealth, I can't go to Florida and get one and then be able to conceal carry in the
Right.
Commonwealth. We're just we're not going to honor that.
Right. A win-win for everybody then.
I believe it was a win-win for everybody, and that's the Virginia way, isn't it? I mean, that's what we came here to do. We didn't come here to. We do bicker, but you know, we do need to compromise, and I think this was a big win-win for everybody.
We got less than 30 seconds, but I-66 is a big issue.
It is. It's a very big issue, and particularly tolling inside the Beltway and tolling on 66, considering those roads were paid for by taxpayers. So we're working on that issue right now.
Great. Thanks for being here, Delegate Michael Webert.
Thank you for having me, Woody. I appreciate it.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.
Mm-hmm.